So in the interest of time, let's just get started. So this is day 2 of the CDM workshop on workflows and business events. There was a first day that was held 2 weeks ago. That was a hybrid session in London, and that was on June 23rd. So this is day 2, and let's go over the logistics of the call. So the workshop is being recorded. And one benefit of that is that we are making the recording available for a limited time. The recording of the first session of the first day is actually available on the link that was distributed with the invite. Please put yourself on mute if you're not speaking, because we expect a lot of people joining the call. Raise your hand when possible to ask any questions. And try to wait until the end of the slide or the module before asking a question. You can alternatively also use the chat box to ask a question, and we'll try to answer those. So the CDM workshop is brought to you by ICMA, International Capital Market Association, ISDA, the International Swaps and Derivatives Association, ISLA, the International Securities Lending Association, FINOS, and Regnosis. So there are a couple of slides on the trade associations. I won't go over them, but essentially you can find information about the trade associations as well as FINOS. The slides, the deck will be made available after the call when we create a page on GitHub for the second day of the workshop. In terms of speakers, again, I'm Litek Lignavieux from ISDA, and I will be your moderator today. Speaking today, we'll also have Leo Lapéis, CEO of Regnosis, and Lionel Smith-Gordon from Regnosis as well, Head of Client Services. This is actually an interactive session, so many of you will have the opportunity to talk and to jump in when we have different discussions. So the objectives of the first day was to present, so 2 weeks ago, was to present the current state. So the event model, the workflow model, how it works today, how it's implemented today. There was a presentation by Lionel from Regnosis. That presentation, that recording is available on the website. So there should be a link in the GitHub page that was set up to provide links to materials, the video, and minutes. So that first day provided an opportunity for firms for people to ask implementation questions and discuss lifecycle events related issues. So we gathered a number of feedback from that first day, and the objectives of today, day 2, is to review the feedback from the first day and to have an additional roundtable with all of you on the call today to gather further comments and to ensure that you have the opportunity to have your voice heard. We will discuss the proposed changes, and the goal is to essentially gather all the feedback and start prioritizing the different issues that we're collating and develop a roadmap. So there will be a time where we will look at the priorities, the sequencing of the different issues, any dependencies, and that will be used to essentially drive the implementation of the issues that are important to people. So this is the proposed agenda for today. So first of all, I should mention that the workshop has been reduced from 5 hours to 4 hours. So this is the agenda, and I'm going to go through it. So first there will be like 2 short breaks in the middle, and where we plan to conclude the workshop 4 hours from now. So we're currently doing the kickoff. And after I'm done, I'm going to discuss a review of the feedback from day one, and then provide an opportunity for people to ask any questions on the current state presentation that was made available online. So we'll dedicate 25 minutes for any questions that people might have on the presentation that Lionel did 2 weeks ago on the current state of the model. So essentially, this is going to be your chance to ask any questions, any clarification on how the current event model works. Then we will have a roundtable number 2. So the first roundtable was 2 weeks ago, and we will give the opportunity for attendees to voice, so to provide feedback, raise issues, provide a wish list of things that they would like to see covered in the business event model. After that, we'll have a short break. And when we come back, we will organize the discussion around themes. So we propose to have three themes, one around workflows. So that will be after the break. And then we will have 2 other themes, which are about quantity change and position. All right. So the theme discussion will last about an hour and 15 minutes, after which we'll have a break, and we'll then discuss for 45 minutes how to maybe tackle things that we can do in terms of documentation, inventory, examples, things that we can improve to increase the understanding and knowledge around this whole topic. And then at the end of the session, at the end of the day, we will spend maybe 15 minutes discussing the roadmap and the prioritization and the next steps. Any questions? If that sounds good, I'm going to go over the list of items that were discussed during the first day. And for that, if you don't mind, I'm going to share on the screen a raw document that we've put together. So it does contain some feedback. So it's not fully edited, but we plan to eventually put a final version of this on the website. So you don't need to make notes or take screenshots. It will be cleaned up and shared. So first, on the current state of the CDM business event model. So as I mentioned, there was a 1-hour presentation by Lionel, who explained the current state as it exists today. There were a number of use cases that were discussed, and these are listed here. So we discussed allocation, clearing, novation, quantity change, compression, and we spoke a little bit about renegotiation. So there was feedback from a number of people who asked questions on different topics. So we had feedback from Tokenovate around innovation business process. And we also had input from George from the TCC on the allocation. So here, I'm not going to go through the details of those discussions, but the idea is that we would maybe provide a summary when possible. And please stop me at any time if you have any questions. So there was some feedback from Dan regarding compression and where the different processes are being used. And now I'm going to essentially go through the set of feedback that were received. So prior to day one, we had gathered input from a handful of firms of people, and Dan had provided an extensive list, which wasn't meant to be a set of open questions, but he wanted to make sure that the sessions covered these topics. And I'm essentially showing the list of items that Dan wanted to have covered. And in red, I have highlighted some of the items that may not have been fully discussed in the first day presentation. Also, so there was a point about what happens when a transition fails, and is there support for bulk invocations of a transition? And number 8, what are there any guidelines for creating like new events? So what do we need to do? Another important point was that it would be very useful to have an inventory of events that are currently supported. And perhaps while we have Dan on the call, I was wondering if I could put you on the spot, Dan, and if you wanted maybe to add anything that I missed in terms of what else needs to be covered. So there will be. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks for putting me on the spot. I did review the materials for the part of the session that I missed. There are some questions that come up from that, which we can talk about in the next stage. I think the inventory, I believe I heard it echoed as a ask from others on the call. And I think the inventory the details about the inventory would be helpful, including with a question to this group about whether it would be additionally helpful as we go through the inventory to state how, to the extent we think that the event is fully supported in at least 2 different views. One is for DRR reporting, which I suspect the answer is yes, it's completely supported. And second is if it were to be used as part of a negotiation process between 2 parties where there's a negotiation to be had. I think that would be helpful. And then I'm just scanning the other questions. I don't know, Litek, how you want to handle other questions that weren't on this list, but I definitely have a few of them. Literally 8 classes of questions.
Yes. So as I mentioned, there will be a roundtable during this. So maybe this can be discussed at that time. So at this point, we just wanted to highlight at the high level what was maybe the items that were covered and maybe some items that need perhaps more attention.
Your initial point was I wasn't there, which is fair for the review. There are some other items that may not have been as well covered as a result of reviewing the materials Lionel presented. And then lastly, of course, with respect to that list, if there are questions about what was meant by any of them, should find a way to talk through those.
So some of the feedback that around that was received was a little bit of ambiguity and confusion around the event intent enum and the relation with the workflow status enum, and whether some items are like events versus statuses. So it would be good to have some consolidation around those enums. So that was echoed by Chris from ISLA. There was also like the discussion about cancellations. So we could be canceling an event, a workflow step, or an entire workflow. So it would be good to have clarity on how to do that. There was also a discussion about the settlement. While transfers are available, so cash transfers and the transfer of security, Chris mentioned that the concept of settlement from a sec landing perspective isn't fully covered yet. So there's room for improvement. So possibly more qualifying functions. And also there's a need to implement the workflows that essentially are the best practices for different products. I'll go through I'll pause here for 15 seconds if people have any input. I'll go through feedback around the two topics that Tom Healy from IGMA raised. So that was around non-trading event management and workflow design. So there was large discussion on the first day around the workflow design, and Tom and others had wanted to discuss the requirements for how we would actually implement workflow designs. So for example, essentially firms are interested to want to understand how to implement like rule books and workflows and automate the workflows. So there was feedback from Tom and other firms. For example, we had a prospective firm interested to understand, if they adopt a CDM, does it imply that there will be interoperability with other firms? Does it ensure that interoperability is going to be taken care of? So there was an entire discussion on how to implement predefined workflows. So for example, you want to know that after one step has taken place, what are the options for the next steps? So that is the idea. Tom, I was wondering if maybe you want to add something to what I just said, maybe in a minute or two.
No, I think that's a great lead. Thanks for covering that. I think as a summary, I think that is what we were looking for. I know it's probably an expansion, quite a bit of an expansion on what we currently have in CDM, and probably may lead to some ways that the model can support this. But yeah, I think it's probably an important area to consider, that a lot of firms already have workflows defined, and it'd be a good idea for the CDM to consider how it can support that. Thanks.
So there was a related discussion about the implementation of rule books. So different firms or trading venues may have different rules on how to implement workflows. What is the next step after a previous one? So there was discussion that maybe we should have like a basic model that doesn't provide a lot of restrictions, but that we would have perhaps extensions to the model that would provide a way for firms to extend the CDM and create like a more restrictive model that could be used by implementations. There was a second topic that Tom was keen on, which is about non-trading events management. So currently, business events and workflows are all really designed around trade events. However, there are a lot of objects at lower levels within the CDM that can persist, but you really don't have a way to make changes to those. So for example, if you want to make a change to a party, such as updating the contact information or updating the LEI. So these are lower level objects that you can create and persist. However, the model doesn't easily allow to execute those changes outside of a trade. So essentially, not everything should be tied to a trade. So there was interest to perhaps handle that. There was support from Chris on this. Chris was looking at operational level agreements between parties, and it would be very useful for him to support his use case. I don't know, Tom, if you want to add anything to.
No, I think an important use case is corporate actions. Corporate actions are at the moment tied again to a trade. So can understand the structure if you have securities or assets linked to a trade and there's corporate action involved. But if you have standalone products, securities or assets, like securities being bonds or equities, and there's a corporate action, and you're storing these, that would be another probably very highly used use case of keeping track of the event that took place that actually involved making a change on the offered amount or calls or something of that sort. So there's a lot of event elements in the model, just not tied to an independent workflow step that you can do outside of a trade.
All right. Thanks, Tom. So these were the two items from Tom, and there was a lot of discussion around these. Let me move to the next set of input that we received. So there was a number of questions or items from a trade header. One was about the relationship between proposed event and business event and next event. So in particular, there was a long discussion on next event. So at first we weren't clear. It had been developed some time ago, and it wasn't clear like whether next event was being used. So Innovate actually came back and said that they had a use case that they had been using the next event. So we essentially, so next event was originally designed to support swing scenarios. So specifically to indicate when the new trade is intended here. So the outcome of the discussion was that the group agreed to revisit the definition and use of next events, taking a different use case into account. There was also a discussion about the counterparty business events, and I believe that there's another down the road, when we get to the list of items from Prognosis. We also had a long discussion about the cancellation of accepted workflows. So there's a need to be able to cancel workflow steps. So the group agreed that this is actually a real world example, and we need the model to be flexible enough to allow this. And we discussed that the CDM should define best practices for the transitions of a workflow step, including cancellations. However, as I mentioned before, when we discussed the workflows and rulebooks, practices may vary by venue. So each venue could publish its own CDM rulebook. So we would need to have possibly extensions to handle those different rulebooks. I don't know if anyone from Trade Header wants to chime in case I butchered the summary.
No, I think that's complete. Thanks, leader.
All right.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Manu. Here there was, I guess, a hit on that point, which is there was a question from a prospective bank that is interested to adopt CDM, but they had questions about workflow orchestration and interoperability, as I mentioned. So that is orchestration and interoperability are 2 points that are very important to ensure the adoption and the success of CDM. Dan did mention that it's also a question about a major version management. So there's some detail in summary here. And perhaps let me add the last point. So about interoperability. So essentially, it's very important because they want to make sure that if they implement CDM, if they use the event model, they want to make sure that other firms that implement CDM will be able to handle the handshakes and the messaging aspect and the business process aspect of their business. All right. So there was moving on to questions that were collated by Regnosis. I won't spend a lot of time on this because, I mean, they've been well laid out, but one of them is a quantity change. There's actually a theme about quantity change that is planned in hour 2 or 3. So essentially, there have been a number of defects that have been raised and discussed in recent contribution review working group meetings. So those have been grouped together, and there's a GitHub issue available. There was a discussion about whether quantity change be commingled with price change. So there was support from Chris to separate the quantity change from the price change. There was also a question on the determination of the current, on whether we should revisit the way termination is currently handled in CDM. So I think the theme session will cover this. There was an issue on the workflow step. So here there could be benefit from streamlining the model, and these are just some examples. The intent model needs to be reviewed. So not only it's being listed here, but also I think it was on the list it was on Dan's list as well on I believe Chris mentioned that as well. So that's on the list for review. There's a need to rationalize reset versus event. There's some work done by Fragmos on this. And again, there's a lot of information here. This document will be cleaned up and shared. And then there was a discussion on trade versus counterparty position, which I believe Trade Heather had also raised. Counterparty position was developed for EMIR. So that's a parallel structure to trade. So here there's the opportunity to clean up, to simplify the model. So that was about all the feedback that we received prior to round 1. And during round 1, there was a dedicated session on a roundtable session where we gathered additional feedback. So I think one of the main, there were a couple of points. I think one of them is an inventory of what's available, what's supported, what is not supported would be very useful. I think another feedback would be to gather, to organize the feedback around themes. And also there was support. There was a suggestion to try to put together some examples of workflows. So that would be very helpful for firms looking to implement this part of the CDM. I think there were some smaller discussions that were picked up in summary about, forgive me. So one of them was the multi-leg structures and packet transactions. So there was a request to maybe review how package transactions are being handled. And I think that's a summary, perhaps a long summary of the discussions that happened on day 1 of the workshop. So that was a lot of information. I'm wondering if there are any questions at this point on what I just said or in topics that were just discussed. So if not, we are on the third session, which is any questions on the current state. So here, what we mean by that is that on day 1, there was a presentation that was recorded where Nell from Regnosis went over the current model as it exists. And we reviewed the different components and we took a look at different use cases. So here we have set aside 25 minutes to, in case people have any questions that they want to ask about the current model. And I would just say that don't be shy. Probably if you have a question, probably 5 other people probably have the same question. So let me open the floor to anyone. And
Litek, I
well,
raised my hand. I don't know if you saw it.
okay, yes, go ahead. Didn't see it.
And so first is, just before I start asking, do we want to get collection of questions at one time, or what's the goal? Question and answer, or just collate a whole bunch of questions?
So we have 25 minutes. Maybe let's start by questions and answers. So we have Lionel and Leo on the call. So let's start by that. And if we run out of time, we may just ask for people to send questions. Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah. Okay. So a number of my questions, I'll just say in advance, are less how does it work and more does it work the way we want? And so, for example, the primitives, not clear to me that they're all really primitives. Like there's number one. And so by primitive, I would assume, let's establish a definition, that it's the lowest level that we can think of, and that each activity is independent of primitive is independent of any other primitive. And it seems to me when I looked through the list of primitives, there was overlap between them. So terms change and quantity change and split, I think, are all primitives, but are they really primitive? So that's an example of a question that I have in reviewing the initial materials. If that kind of question we should park to later, that's fine. There are other questions which are, please explain what this means.
Yeah, unless Regnosis wants to chime in quickly, perhaps we can park that question because it seems like it needs more detailed answer. Lionel,
So
go
if
ahead.
I can just chime in for just a few seconds. I think that point is well noted and is somehow being addressed or slightly adjacent to the section when we're going to discuss about quantity change. So we can, in short, we can probably expand from the quantity change discussion to talk about that comment or question. Do we have a partition of the world with primitives?
Okay, cool. That definitely works. That's why I said it. And there are, Litek, there are a collection of, is this fit for purpose for what we want to do or not? And it may well be, I'm not saying it isn't, but there are a number of questions like that. Similar kind of a question is, are the history collections what we want them to be? They seem to be, with no critique, implied, a bit arbitrary. Reset, I forget the other ones, but it's not clear to me why we're categorizing history in that particular way. If I remember correctly, there are 2 that are specific and then all other. That's again a broader question. Let me just look to see. I'm happy to yield the floor there. I'm looking through my collection of questions to see if there's anything that's, so a similar kind of question. Is there a challenge to using qualifications to determine after the fact the state of of an item? Anyway, those are the nature of my questions. There really are less, what does this mean? And more, is this what we want? And it may be, by the way, I'm not saying it isn't what we want, just seems to me like we could have a bit of a discussion about that.
I recall in one of perhaps the Dirties working group or the CRWG, there was a discussion about the history, the framework for history, and there had been like a suggestion or to rationalize or so I think there was a need to add another kind of history, and perhaps instead of doing that, I think there was a discussion to perhaps have a more generic history structure. I don't know if you're Leo or Larry now.
I don't recall, but I haven't participated in all of the derivatives working group. But I think it's a fair comment.
Dan, sorry, did you have 2 questions in one or was it the first question?
I have a collection of questions that are all about, is this where we want to end up in terms of solution design? I'm scanning through my questions. I don't have many questions that are, could you please explain what this means? So I think actually the one question that is, can you please explain what this means? It's not entirely that, but can we assume that today all events are defined in Rune, i.e. there's no direct use of Java? And that might be an inventory question, by the way.
If you can just clarify the question when you say they are all in Rune, do you mean that the logic for all of the events is exposed in the DSL? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, thank you, Leo. I'm sorry I wasn't clear. It's exactly that, not that there aren't, I forget what the tag is in Rune, implementation or something that says you're not, all that's defined in Rune is the input and the output, but the business logic is implemented elsewhere.
Yeah. So short answer to your question is no. However, making sure that they all get exposed. We are also going to discuss that as part of the quantity change discussion, because there is at least some logic there that is not exposed and which would be beneficial to be exposed.
So it goes a long way.
At least that's the direction of travel.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
I'd like to check if anyone in the room would like to ask any questions. Perhaps you are not understanding parts for a concept and would like to have an explanation from Lionel. Any questions of that nature? Simple questions or complex questions? So the presentation is available online, so you can take a look at it. And if there are no questions, we can just move on to the next session. So last chance in one. All right. So let's take a look at the agenda. And so we're moving to agenda item number 4, which is another round of Roundtable. So here we want to open the floor for people to raise questions or to discuss issues or wish list that they have, perhaps gaps that they are identified or things that they are stuck on while implementing CDM. So we have set aside 30 minutes for this. Anyone wants to take the lead and ask the first question. So I see that there's an overlap between attendees from day 1 and day 2. So in day 2 today, we have a number of attendees that weren't on the first call. Please don't be shy in case you have any questions or want any implementation questions. If you want to raise any issues, or if you're wondering if what you're trying to do is covered here. Let me take a look at the list of participants. I'm going to pick 3 persons randomly. No, I'm just kidding. Does anyone have, I'm not going to pick anyone in particular, but this is the opportunity if you have a question, any question, or if you want to provide any feedback.
Just a good time to raise some of those fit for purpose questions.
Sure. Yeah. Please go ahead with that.
Okay. And chime in, people, others who have interest should really feel free to interrupt me. So when we look at it, there's a whole collection of activities around inventorying. Some of these are with respect to that. When we look at the inventory of the states, it seems to me there's a question about whether we're right now have all the states that we want. I remember there was a discussion about accepted, rejected, and in as much as CDM isn't a negotiation protocol, it doesn't necessarily need accepted or rejected. But if we want to get to collaborative use, then we do need to know whether the workflow event is whether all parties accept the workflow event. I'm not certain what the solution is here. I'm just acknowledging that to be in the state where 2 parties, let's make it simple, the 2 parties of a transaction have the same view of the transaction, we need some mechanism to acknowledge that a state change is accepted by a party. So I don't know the answer, but I raised it as a question for our list of discussion items. A second question is, there are multiple ways to get a transaction to the same state. And I know we're going to talk about notional quantity change later. That is a question about whether that potential leads you to the opportunity that you might not know exactly what state you're in because you've gotten to a particular state, let's say zeroing out quantity, in different ways. And I'm using that as an example, but that's not the only one to list, I think. Is that what we want, or do we want to have only one way to get something to a particular state? If we don't do that, meaning have only one way to get to a particular state, then in some respects we will rely upon qualifications to determine what state is, and qualifications after the fact can be a little tricky to manage, as I think we've seen around product qualifications. I have more. I'm going to pause for a second to see if anybody else wants to jump in with their own.
I'm just going to jump in on that, and just taking a step back, maybe on a couple of points that you raised, which I agree with. But I think one of the things that probably we need to do in the model is to be clear about what different states are used and what they mean, because we need a definition, let's say, around exactly what does it mean to make a change on a trade state, and what does it mean to make a change on a workflow state. or workflow step, and then which encompasses, let's say, a state, and then the workflow itself. I think there's a little bit of, I can figure out most of it, but recently it's just come up as to some of the conditions, some of the enumerations around states, accept or reject or new or cancel. Are they referring specifically to the workflow step that was attempted to take place, or are they actually referring to the end result of the action, right? So there could be just a failure in terms of its process, or there could be a failure because one side rejected it. So I think there's just some aspects of this that potentially a lot of pieces there to use. I just think maybe some clarity around some of those states would be useful, and specifically around each different level, the workflow step, the business event, right? So we have these layers, business event, and then let's say it's a trade and it's trade state. And each one of those probably can be in different states, right? They all mean different things as to what may have taken place. I think it would be maybe worthwhile. This is probably not the forum where all of that can be figured out, but maybe there's some thoughts on what states are needed and what those states should be.
Yeah. So, Litek, I would second Tom's suggestion that we have a bit of maybe a gap in or refresh from Lionel's presentation where we ensure that there's a decent and reasonably strict definition about workflow step, business event, instruction, primitive instruction, or whether that's implemented today or is something we want to work towards, because that then drives an inventory of all of the rest, because you can say, okay, now here's our definition of what these are, here's what have you. And it may be clear, for my part, it may be clear to everyone else.
I think that's but yeah, go ahead.
And I note that Leo has his hand up and Kat came, I'll hand up.
Hey, yes, so you are both right that a clear separation between the purpose in life of a workflow and the purpose in life of a business event, or also known as lifecycle event, should be clearly separated. The current model, in the way it is being implemented, looks to do that. However, there are some areas of, particularly around the workflow, where a blurring of the line still exists. I think you may be referring to that particular enum whose name I forgot, which is something like workflow state enum, where, and sadly, it still mixes business event concept and workflow event. So I think there is probably some work that needs to be done there to make that a lot more rational. But effectively, like the state of a trade, which is being impacted by a business event that effectively does a state transition, should really be seen as orthogonal to workflow state, which are more an implementation concern. What are the different things that the parties have to do to get to an accepted state transition? And really the separation between workflow and business event is meant to reflect that. I think what you are both saying is there's, and which I'm concurring with, there is some unfinished business here, which we should look to rationalize. So I think and by the way, that's handled, I think, in the latter part again of the conversation when we are going to talk about workflow. On the first point you were making, Dan, I think I would say probably it would be good to, the first question you are asking, is there more than one way to arrive at the same state for a trade? And I think it would be good. Personally, my view is that we should have as a sort of statement that the CDM looks to support is effectively a unique way of arriving at a particular state, at least in one go. If you have a specific example of where that is not the case, I think that would be, I'm clearly separating that from I've gone from A to B, but having gone from A to B in a unique way, I'm not really sure how to qualify the transition I've just gone through. I see that as different from there is more than one way to go from A to B. So if you have a specific example of the latter, I think that would be great if we could look at that and potentially look at some adjustments if that's the case. But I hope I was clear in separating the two. More than one way to get to B when you start from A in one go versus once I've gotten from A to B in a single way, am I able to stay what it is that I went through as a transition?
So
those are two different problems.
yeah, I think the question I'm asking is imagine, and this may not be a good example. So please, for those who are more expert in events, please correct me. But I know we have the ability to reduce a notional to zero as an activity. And I know we're talking about quantity changes together later. At the moment that the quantity is zero on all the notional actively terminated, and that would then see, plus I would imagine we also have the ability to terminate. And so those are two ways to realize the same outcome. If we don't have one path and we're not really careful about quantity adjustment, we end up with the potential that it's effectively terminated, but not terminated. It effectively terminated meaning there's no notional, but it's not terminated because it hasn't been flagged as terminated. So a external system that was trying to be managing the life cycle of a transaction wouldn't know to just stop on this particular transaction. It might be trying to reset, even though there's nothing really to reset. That would be an example of multiple paths to achieve the same state. And they may, but
it's an example. Dan, it's an example, but it's not a one that applies in this case because there is no such thing as a termination primitive. And that's potentially that's actually what is going to be discussed in the quantity change primitive, but in the particular example you stated does not exist.
Okay. Good news was it was a good example that doesn't exist. So thank you. And if there are no others, then it's a moot question. I'm not expert enough in events to be able to tell you whether there are others. And I'm going to hand off to Lionel, who's got his hand up.
Just reflecting on the conversation we're having here, I think there's perhaps a need to separate issues that we see in the model itself in differentiating some of these concepts and modeling them correct, and the documentation. So the presentation I did last time was largely based on the documentation. And one of the things that we've tried to do in the last year is improve the documentation. There's always more to do, and that's a subject that a number of the trade associations have considered to some extent. But what I would refer you to, and the source for much of the presentation 2 weeks ago, was the cdmfinos.org website where the event model is described. And what we've tried to do there previously is make sure there are very tight definitions of some of the key terms, particularly the ones shown on the slide at the moment: business event, workflows, step, primitive, etc. Now, I think the unanswered question is that documentation actually correct? And secondly, is that documentation actually accurately reflecting what the model is trying to do? And then perhaps third, is the model trying to do the right thing? So I think one of the considerations that we might have towards the end of this meeting, because I think we're going to talk a little bit about knowledge and adoption is what work might need to be done on the documentation side.
Which is a good discussion. Any other people would like to discuss?
Yeah, Litek, maybe just in the course of what we're doing here, so that after we go through this process, we have an action item, right? Or have action items that we'll move forward on, which I think will probably ultimately be decided what further steps need to take place and so on. I'm just thinking in the context of a lot of the discussion here, there's a lot of things coming up that either need further action or clarification or something. I'm just thinking in the vein that we were just discussing, I'm going back to this topic of the estates. One thing I would suggest, and this, I can give a specific example of this without getting into the weeds on it yet, is that though the workflow steps or the data type, the class workflow steps, needs to be cleaned up in terms of its definition and the attributes that make it up. The reason I mention it is that under workflow steps, there's some things that are very clear, like a business event, right? So you tie it to a business event. And this doesn't show up on the diagram or the documentation. This, you have to look at the model to see where these things look a little confusing. So business event makes a lot of sense. Proposed event, as we were discussing, makes a lot of sense. But then there is an item down there, which is the credit limit information. And you have to maybe ask why something like that at that level exists at that level, because it belongs most likely someplace where it needs to be used relative to an action, right? So that would be, okay, the credit limit information is needed if you're going to do a credit limit check, or you're doing a margin calculation or something like that. Those are all processes. Those are all events. That's one case where I say, I'm not quite sure why that's there, right? The same is true with the two items up a little bit further, which are the reject attribute and the approval attribute. There's an approval attribute. If you click on approval, it says approved and party, but then there's an option there for rejected reason. I'm not sure, are we talking about approval of the workflow? Are we talking about of the workflow step? Or are we talking about some other approval that could involve the rejection? It's not like clear to me. Again, these are definition things. And then if you look at reject, which is a Boolean yes, no, what is it? What action took place to reject it? Was it that the workflow step just couldn't be completed, or does it mean it was rejected by a party or some part of the party or some part of the process? And therefore, then maybe you would need to know, okay, what was the reason for it being rejected? I know we can't get into the weeds of going through each one of these. I would suggest as an action that we, beginning from the workflow step, have a clear definition of what a workflow step is supposed to encompass and clean up the attributes that are plugged into this step.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I would fully agree with that. I think that's one of the purpose of the next sections on workflow. Exactly. Trimming it down to size.
Yeah, I think, again, without going like account, like these things, account, I'm not quite sure why that's there. Action, this goes back to the point about the enumerations. If you look at action, this one, okay, you can grasp and know exactly, is this a new workflow step? Is it a corrected workflow step, or is it canceled? And okay, that's good. But then when you start going in down to other, if you then look at workflow state, right, you start to raise questions about what those states mean relative to the actions, right? So this would be, like I said, the first step is cleaning it up, making it just specific to workflow and generic types of workflow. And say, what does it mean in terms of it's a new workflow step, hasn't been done yet. This is what it is. And then say, okay, these are the states or the steps that take place in the workflow. I think we just move through the top all the way down through the process here. Again, I don't know, more of a discussion about how to frame or scope it, and then move on to doing it through some probably, maybe we need separate task groups to undertake some of addressing some of these things. But this is where, having recently tried to do a mapping and process mapping and workflow mapping between a back office system and the model, it's uncovered a number of these questions.
Yeah, this is good feedback. In terms of like next steps, we will address those in the last session of the day. Like, how do we move this forward? Who owns the task? So we'll discuss that.
LeTech, as part of that review, again, in the context that it may be all sorted for others, or maybe sorted. It seems to me that we're carrying, I think I heard Tom's comment also echoing that we may be carrying state at many different levels in the process. And that then leads you to worry about conflicting information at different levels in the process. So I think that if we're going to look to review it with the eye towards rationalization, we should decide what state can be at what level. Like, with the idea that anytime that you can express the same view of state at different levels, you're stuck with what happens if that information is conflicting at the different levels.
You're just, you're saying that my mind was just thinking task force. But let's discuss that towards the end of the call. Any other comment that people would like to make on any subject? Any additional feedback, wish list?
Yeah, LeTech, if I could again probably add something onto the wish list. So this relates to going back to, I guess just going back to the diagram again. One thing that's useful, although not clear how to implement, is if you go down, scroll down to the bottom of that diagram, you'll see a little bit further over to the, exactly. So one thing that's quite useful is this party customized workflow, because we're starting to get into, obviously when you get into this workflow stuff, you start to get into a lot of very customized workflows, right? When we're dealing with trade states, things are a little bit clearer. Workflow steps, especially go from front office through middle to back and so on, you start uncovering all kind of custom workflows. So I guess the one question is the customized workflow. If you go one step down further for where it says customized workflow. So here you can essentially put in your own name and value. This is quite useful. I guess the question comes up is like, how do we recommend or suggest this being used? In other words, how do you incorporate this into your overall workflow? How does it get used in any way, right? So how does it get incorporated overall into the model? if you're going to use these yourself, right? So these are nice tags or putting identifiers on a customized workflow. But I think going back to these levels, it may be not exactly clear how all these things relate to what you're doing with your own customized workflow, because these are really customized tags underneath a workflow state. So I think they're useful, quite useful, but maybe we need some clarity about how they should be used. And maybe there's other parameters, customized parameters that could be included. So that's probably something to discuss when we do this restructuring of this.
All right. Made a note of that. Yeah. All right. Any last comment from anyone? Let me see if anyone has their raise. So no one has any additional feedback. Let me take a look at the schedule. Cannot see all right. So I suggest that we take a small break. Let's reconvene 9 minutes from now at 5 past the hour. And then we'll start discussing the different themes, starting with workflows. So let me put myself on mute and we'll be back at 5 past. Thanks. Let's get started in 1 minute. All right, welcome back, everyone. So we're going to shift the gears a little bit, and we're going to break down into the discussion into themes. And the first one will be about workflows. So let me bring up the slide. So we have put together a list of questions and around workflows, and the idea is to accumulate like discussions. And for that, let me actually turn it over to Leo to tackle this session. Leo, do you want to lead the session?
Yeah, no, sorry. Yeah, more. It's going to be turning to participants really for intervening, but the idea was to start with a series of questions to try and frame the discussion. And I think a lot of it is going to echo what has been discussed in the previous part of our workshop today. But I think it's about simplifying the workflow object, streamlining it, making it more fit for purpose. And maybe before we do that, almost an overarching question based on what I heard from the previous comment is it worth just, number one, spending a little bit of time just making sure that the mission statement of that component in the CDM is well understood and is well shared, and B, to the extent that it is well shared, making sure that it is documented as such. And number three is effectively making sure that the model reflects that mission statement, or if it doesn't, that we can put a plan in place to make it fulfill that mission. So I'll just making a pause there, but just asking the first question, which is it worth just level setting on the mission statement of that object first and foremost?
Sorry, Leo, the mission statement is what's on the screen. So what you mean?
No, that is more like an overarching question. Before we actually start to dive into the details is what is on screen, but more maybe it would be worth level setting on reminding what the mission statement is and making sure that it's well shared by other participants.
And Leo, this is Dan. Do you mean mission statement for these sessions or the mission statement?
No,
for
mission
workflow?
statement, the purpose in life of the component workflow.
Yeah, I think that would be awesome personally.
So in a nutshell, and we can refer to it by contrast with business event. Business event is pure in the sense that it describes a state transition that a trade goes through. So this is the way by which a trade is in a certain state A and goes to another state B by going through a state transition. And effectively, a business event describes that state transition. And in particular, it captures, number one, the inputs that you need to be able to do that transition. And number two is based on those inputs, what is the logic? Once you apply those inputs, what is the logic that goes from A to B? So in a way, it's almost like a sort of mathematical definition, if you want to think about it this way. And in the latter part of the discussion, we're going to talk about, is there a unique way to go from A to B and all of this, but that's going to be in the latter part of the workshop. So now once we've said that, we know that in the real world, in the way those transitions are implemented, there are going to be a lot more, I was going to say messy, but potentially very much more implementation specific ways by which this is going to be executed. And we know that in most of, or at least in a vast number of the life cycle events that trades go through, typically there is some sort of approval or reconciliation process that may involve one or more parties, depending on what the event is, before that state transition becomes reality. And that might be implemented in many different ways and is potentially a lot more bespoke. This is also where considerations such as timestamps, when did someone do what in relation to that business event? Did they approve? Did they reject? Did they do all these things are being captured? And that, if you want to think of a system to implement that, also has some sort of state in a way. But this has nothing to do with the state of the trade. This has everything to do with the particular stage a workflow is in, which in most cases will go from something which is being proposed to eventually something which is being accepted. And as the case may be, even after that, something that might get canceled or rejected or corrected, even after it has been accepted. So it goes through those different stages.
Just to try and just parse what you're saying, or at least how I understand it, if the business event memorializes the state change of the trade state, then the workflow is the business event state change. So propose the business event and then it gets accepted, or there's a way of managing the sort of a meta level above that allows you to change the state of the business event. That's how I've always envisioned this. Is that?
It's a very good way. It's a very good way of putting it in.
So it has a lot of utility in that, I think. So definitely, but yeah. Okay. So if a workflow event, if a workflow step if a business event doesn't succeed as memorialized in the workflow step, then the trade state doesn't change.
Correct. That's
Generally, yeah. Okay, just one quick question, and I see Plowman has his hand raised. Can we also discuss the relationship between business event and instructions? Because it would seem to me, I had assumed that it was instructions that really changes the state.
No, the instruction gives you the recipe for how to change it. But the business event is effectively memorializes the state transition.
And
the instruction is the recipe. The business event is the cake, to do an analogy.
And let us eat cake.
Plenty.
A very quick question, actually. So business event is the thing which moves the state of the trade from one state to the next or to our target state. How do you see it as a zero time event, or do you see that this takes some longer periods, which you indicated, by the way, that you see that there is probably an embedded workflow, which leads to fully implementing or rolling back basically the business events. Do you see that reflected in the model itself in some way, shape or form, or do you think this is has to be completely exogenously managed by the implementing system?
Can I ask and pardon it's my own ignorance, for a term clarification? When you say zero time event?
That means that it's intended as an atomic, indivisible step.
I see. So yeah, a resounding yes. A business event is atomic. It's all or nothing. You can't do part of a business event. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much. And to the second part of the question, So you see that the business event may actually be implemented as a workflow on its own, including internal approvals and stuff like that. But at the end, it will have either succeeded or failed, result, if you like.
Yeah, that is correct. But I think what we are, and that was one of the question that was raised earlier, which is, can you, if something has been accepted and effectively the state transition has become a reality, what happens if later on, by agreement between the parties, it gets cancelled? Well, somehow you have to go and roll that back. I think it's going to depend on. I think it would be hard for the CDM to start to venture into addressing all of those, but at least there should be sufficient enough components in the model that would let implementers implement that one way or another, i.e. some may live in a immutable world, in which case, once it's accepted, it's done. And if you roll it back, then you literally have to go and do the opposite event. Or some may choose to live in a world where, no, that's fine, I'm going to remove it and pretend as if nothing happened. We can't. I have a hard time figuring how the CDM could really answer those and provide almost like an implementation for that. I think it should steer quite clear of that consideration, whilst having enough data points in the model to allow implementers to do what they need.
Understood. Thank you very much. I guess there is a lot of value in defining it as an atomic step because it's a true building block in that sense.
Yeah.
Which allows you to then venture out and do whatever additional logic or workflows you might wish to implement on it. But at least there is a bedrock on which you can stand and say, this is an event and has happened, or it doesn't have happened. It will give you at least the ground of your implementation. Thank you very much. I understand. Thank you.
Okay. So is there no objection to the way we've defined the purpose of workflow and workflow step in their relation to business event? If that's okay, then ensures that there should probably be some simplification that we can bring to that object along the lines of what Tom mentioned earlier. So some of those are covered in the next question. And I don't see that as exhaustive, but it is more to kickstart the discussion. Tom, since you mentioned that earlier, is there something that you would want to add, or maybe ways by which you'd like to drive that?
I just in the scope of this here, I just want to maybe raise the question of whether we're going to leave the business event structure as is, which includes a after trade state. So business events essentially are meant for acting on trades. And we raised this question earlier about events that we may need that take place for non-trade objects. I think maybe in the overall context of this would be the discussion of whether we're going to leave the definition of business events to being only trade-related business events, or we're going to create some other kind of business event object for non-trade objects.
My approach would be the former, which is to restrict the scope of business event to operate on one type of entity, which is trade, with the assumption that updating an instance of a CDM object by implementers, they can do that without having to recourse to an event model. Where it's really useful to have an event model is really for the trade lifecycle. There may be other areas, which you mentioned, Tom, around the asset servicing for corporate actions, for instance. But for now, I wouldn't make the problem bigger but by extending it to other type of object. I would restrict the scope of business event to be really the trade lifecycle. and the rest can be handled directly by implementers, by effectively, let's say you have a database, for instance, you can update objects in a database in the way fit.
Okay.
Sorry, is that true? Is that true today, Leo? Or is
Yeah,
that
it is,
just...
it is true today that it is restricted to trade in its scope.
But but is it, how is that restriction affected? Is it just the fact that all the business events at present amend the trade state and have trade as the key object within them?
Correct.
Or
Yes.
yeah.
But it's the after state, the only after state object is defined as a trade.
Yeah.
That's a trade state, actually. The after object can only be a trade state,
Yeah.
which that, I guess,
That could be enhanced or changed, but for the purpose of this work, maybe we don't want to talk about that. But I'm just wondering, is there a concept of a business event could be a legal agreement or a security, right? Or something like that. You could extend in that direction without breaking this concept of business event, the trade state business event and workflow. I don't think I've said anything that's wrong there, just to give us an
the question is whether we could just implement this to be a generic object, and you then could use it for trade, or you can use it for legal agreement, or you can use it for...
I agree, indeed. But I think the question, I agree, and I would also extend it to portfolios and books of trades and things like that, thinking of some of the original design principle. But also we have to think about the de facto fact that the most of these use cases would be for trade, and most of the business events for something like securities wouldn't be the same business events you would use on a trade as a security. Does that make sense? Or a legal contract or something like that. So there might be a natural delineation between them, but I agree with the spirit, Tom. So I do agree with you that something generic would be better, but you'd probably end up seeing a pattern that would also emerge. Does that make sense? I'm not sure.
Yeah,
I think
it does, but again, I like a view, but I think they are different enough that I think it's a separate model. Like we have a trade lifecycle model, and which may be different from a legal agreement lifecycle model, which may be very different from a product asset servicing lifecycle model.
Yeah. I think in that regard, we're agreeing. Sorry.
One quick observation on that one. If you guys wanted to have a bit of a more shared implementation, one could say you have at the top, say, an abstract state machine implementation, which moves an item from state to state and defines the allowed relations. And then you have a specialization, which is, or this state machine, which is a trade life cycle, and another specialization, which is a legal contract specialization. So that you still have the common ground in terms of implementation, but you then specialize into the particular workflows in your modeling in the different categories. I don't know whether this helps, but just strikes me as one possible way to have a shared common ground between those, but still keep them separate. As Lionel said, they're different. They're sufficiently different to be modeled as the different parts of the model. Anyway, thank you.
As it relates to this list of things, I would also say that we could remove credit limit information. I think we could also remove the account as well. I don't see them at the same level as managing a workflow stack. They may be needed, but and they may be part of workflows, but it's not clear at this level, the account information that's there, what does it relate to exactly? That's not, and what does it relate to that's not encompassed within the business event, right? So the business event definition and its instruction is supposed to, the business event instruction to the instruction is supposed to define exactly what's supposed to take place. Not sure why both credit information and account belong at this level.
Yeah, I would second that. Actually, account, your point about account is in question 5. It's just that the formatting didn't make it obvious that it was proposing to so remove that. But you're right about the other one, credit limit information, which I think is more of this one is a lot more like a specialization of the utilization of workflow by a particular type of entity, and which can be in their own bespoke private extension of that workflow. Effectively, the workflow object in CDM provides the basic support, and then they can always extend that with their own bespoke information if they wanted to, or use the one that you showed earlier, Tom, on screen, where there is this kind of generic structure where you can add those bespoke workflow message in a way.
Should we go through these questions in order? And I noticed that there's questions from Manuel, which probably chime with some of the questions proposed here in your slide. That you help.
I can wait until this slide is completed.
Sorry, you raised another question, Manuel?
Yes, a couple of questions. They are related to the persistence of the states as they work right now in the model, and also the purpose of a specific attribute, the previous workflow step. So those are related mostly with the first question here, the removal or not of the proposed event.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so maybe we start with that, but effectively you have two attributes, proposed event and business event. Essentially, they are the same. It's just that one is before it's accepted and the other one is meant to represent after it's been accepted. I can't really think of any good reason why we should handle it as separate attributes. At the end of the day, regardless of in which state it is, has it been proposed, has it been rejected, has it been accepted, the business event remains exactly the same. It's just a matter of whether that state transition becomes effective or not. I would propose to handle really the stage in which it is at by the right enums, and always handle what is the business event that we are talking about with a single attribute. That would make the structure simpler.
And that enum will be at the workflow step level.
Yeah, and exactly. And we're gonna discuss that later. But would there be any objection to doing that?
Leo, when we're talking about that, should we include counterparty proposed business event as well?
Yeah, but different kettle of fish. We're going to talk about position later on. So yes, you are right, Dan. But the flavor of that conversation is probably more geared towards another theme that we're going to tackle later in the discussion.
Okay.
One question, removing the proposed event, which is the event instruction, as you say, the business event is an extension of this.
Yeah.
Would that mean that we will need to re-implement or remodel all the conditions around when a business event was accepted, proposed, rejected, etc.? And did you mention an enum? Do you think it's enough with an enum to handle these different states?
Yeah, and if the enum is not enough, then we should augment the enum. But in other words, I think it would make the implementation of the conditions much easier. And in fact, some of those, I assume that a lot of those conditions are, if the enum has this value, then you need to have a proposed, but you can't have a business event or things like that, which actually become meaningless the moment you start to streamline the object. I think the only reason why we had those conditions is because the object was too complex, and therefore we needed to check to have an internal validity of the data to make sure it's good. But if we make the object simpler, then we don't need to have those.
So we basically could end up having a business event which doesn't contain any after trade state, just the event instruction, for example, for an execution, and some previous state there.
Yeah.
Would that be considered as an accepted in the chain? So as a valid initial step for all the states?
Sorry, can you repeat that last?
Yeah, so if I'm not mistaken, business events are meant to model post-trade events as of right now.
Yep.
So all those need a trade state, right?
Yep.
So basically, are we saying that maybe execution is not a post-trade event? It's actually a very different event, that it's the only instance which will contain a business event without after trade state?
We learn it's before. No?
Yeah, it doesn't have any before.
It's the before, yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't have any.
No, it specifically doesn't have a before that way. It's designed that way, yeah.
You're right, yeah. Okay, thank you.
I think one of the, if we wanted to have a bit more caution in the model, we could say things like, if you are in an accepted state, then you need to have the after trade state populated, for instance.
That can be modeled as a condition.
It's very easy to do.
And while we're talking about accepted, there seems like a confusion, or it's confusing to me how we have approval as a collection of information and rejected as a binary state. It seems to me all of those there's really something about approved or rejected, and there's other information that you'd want to collect alongside it.
Yeah. This is tackled by the third question.
Okay.
But you're absolutely right. There are just too many attributes that are trying to say the same thing.
And not only that, there are some people who are asking questions that are going to get answered later.
Are participants asking questions on the chat or somewhere else?
That was a self-read.
I think both of my questions are resolved. If we remove the proposed event, there's no problem. We got some questions around when to persist the proposed events and how the relation with previous proposed step works.
Yeah. Okay, I guess that makes it simpler. Is there, sorry, just repeating my housekeeping question, but is there a way by which participants are asking questions on the chat or somewhere LitTech? Do you see that? I'm not seeing any of that, so I just want to make sure we're not missing
So
the chat on the Zoom chat, can you not see that?
So the chat is available.
Yeah, okay, I got it. Right.
Hands.
Right, okay, got it. Sorry.
Tom has his hand up as well.
Yeah, so I would just maybe like to ask, since if we're not going to undertake addressing the, let's say, non-trade event, business event at this point, I think we should put a placeholder in to possibly initiate a task force to look at this. And the reason is I have 3 use cases where I think this is really important and could become limiting at this point. Besides changing objects, we wanted to implement pre-trade workflows involving negotiations and so on. And those are very specific event processes that go on. And if everything begins at an execution, obviously we cannot implement the pre-trade part of this. And the other related is around issuance. So issuance of new bonds is going to be a different workflow. Again, it's not an execution, it's its own workflow thing that would require workflow steps and events that be constructed around it. So if we're not going to do it now, I would just say that maybe we should put it on the table for initiating a task force to look at it.
On that, do you? My suggestion, Tom, do you want to bring it at the next Steerco? And I think those two are very different. So the second one for me is definitely in the same way as we have trade life cycle, we have the product life cycle for the case of a transferable product, which might be describe an asset. On the first case, the only reason why everything starts at execution is, I think it's more a result of the fact that there was a conscious focus not to try to boil the ocean, to start at the execution so that we only handle post-trade. But really, if you think about it, you can see it as a continuum starting from the negotiation. And then once that negotiation concludes, then it results in an execution. So in effect, execution just being one of the states in the life cycle that actually started earlier than that. So I think potentially this one could be considered as an extension of the trade life cycle to cover pre-trade and not just post-trade.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that too. I don't think it's just the fact that this is what's there now and the rest can be developed. You could use the same model execution for creating an instrument with all the terms and then wrapping it in a security with a little bit of adjustment. And that's how I'd approach it. And copying that across and calling it issuance would be the right way to do it so that it is kept separate but looks the same and whatever with the same with the other. But I support the idea of putting it out there, Tom, and making sure that people have the opportunity to come in and expand in that direction. But I think right now we should deal with what's already there. But I don't think there's nothing saying we have to start with execution. But there was never an intention to. Yeah.
Oh, what it implies is that workflow step or business events are really post-execution specific.
Right now.
Or maybe part of it. Yeah. Error. And maybe if that's the flow that we're talking about, absent the painful impact of it, it may be that they need a bit of renaming.
Yeah, we could replace workflow with post-trade workflow, maybe. Yeah, that's potentially one thing. But the patterns, I think I'd like to see repeated, or effectively you could do a lot of things with a lot of the same primitives.
So just actually, again, I think maybe we can define them a little bit clearer and then bring them up to the steering committee as to which ones we can move forward on. It had just hit me that one more use case, which is even more relevant, is the transfer event. So the transfer primitive it's a built-in primitive, yet it's tied to a trade. But there's a lot of transfers that go on of cash and securities, especially securities you're pledging for margin into an account, or you would say from one portfolio to another portfolio to an account, that you cannot effectively do through a workflow. Understand the scope definition now is workflow business events, all related to trades. But if we're trying to cover a broader range of a life cycle of what goes on, transfer is one really immediate problem, and then the other ones I mentioned before.
Yeah, I'd really support that. It's almost like a transfer as its own life cycle. Yeah, agree. Shall we try and move on to discuss next event?
Yeah, I was going to suggest that. If you could explain your concerns. I see the usage of it or utility of it in trying to schedule your workflow. So yeah, what are you thinking here?
What I'm thinking is, as soon as we start talking about a different business event, then it's a different workflow. And implementers can tie those together. I think the reason for its introduction and the original use case was really for a very specific purpose, which was at the point of execution, I want to know whether that trade is intended for clearing. And effectively, you capture that in the next event. But effectively, it's a big object to carry just for that very specific use case. So what my proposition would be to strike out this attribute and handle that very specific use case in a more compact, targeted way for that.
So leaving everything to the implementer in terms of scheduling the events.
Yeah.
But even though the parameters are potentially known to construct this, just thinking beyond the very linear trade management, if I'm trying to set up all the cash flows over time or something like that.
It is.
I think the point you mentioned is different, which is how does a trade know what's its next business event? If all things being equal, i.e. if something doesn't intervene in the meantime where the parties actually change the details of the trade, everything else staying equal, the trade should be able to know what its next event is about. That
Exactly.
I would fully support that.
Yeah.
But I don't think adding a next event attribute in business event is the way to achieve that. I think this has a lot more to do with having the right logic at the trade level so that you can infer that.
So you support that, but where would you put it? Sorry, I didn't quite catch it.
I would see it as a calculated outcome of the current trade state.
Okay. So I can see it being important to standardize it and having it in CDM, but I agree with you, it's very heavy to carry. So maybe there's it's moved to the side as a side solution. There's a way to do this and generate it and calculate it from the parameters, but we don't carry it on the workflow. I hear you on that front, yeah. Sorry, someone else is going to speak.
It's Dan. I have two comments. The first is that, in essence, it seems to me that the next events are really a collection of either events or instructions that you can go to from a particular state. And second is, it seems to me that it's implied if you attempt a business event where the trade can't go to that business event, then you're going to need that logic anyway. So it's really, in some respects, it's about exposing the collection of next business events that are valid from a particular state. Right. If it's created and you wanted to go to reset, for example, without having been hit that execution step, then you might want that to fail. I'm not saying you do, but you might want that to fail. And if you do, you need some way to know that. And if you do need some way to know that, then we're really talking about exposing those collection of states that you can go to from a particular state. I'm sorry, I may have confused there. It been quite confusing, but.
I think that's potentially a harder problem to expose all the possible next ones versus exposing the single one if everything else stays equal.
But you need that lot. You agree that if you try to execute a next business event, you need to know whether the current state can go to the next state. Right? It's logic that and maybe it's just from created.
I think it's just in the database though. If you're it's a way to quickly schedule everything. So you don't have to work things out over all the parameters. Sorry, all the cash flows over time. You just need the next one. because you're going to do right now. You're going to do say an interest payment next week, barring some change to the parameters negotiated by the parties midweek.
I think as maybe pointed out, this next event, it's probably not really clear even how to use it, and it's incomplete in its ability to support a prescribed workflow. So again, I'm not really sure how to use it at this point. Wouldn't really disagree with removing it. I think we should, again, this goes maybe to something to bring up to the steering committee, because I think we do need to think about the prescribed workflows, right? We're talking about workflows, events are essentially records of what took place, right? And that's how it's implemented. Prescribing workflows where you have multiple next steps that can take place would require a modeling, or either you have to figure out how to do this with a separate model or separate exterior application to support interactions with the CDM for workflow events like this, or we come up with a model of how the workflows would be designed. Again, it's probably extending the scope of the CDM, and so would require steering committee work approval. I personally think it'd actually be quite useful, but
Okay, so in the meantime, if we want to keep the purpose in life of workflow, which is kept recording all the steps that eventually lead to a business event being executed, then if we want to follow that principle, then that argues in favor of removing that. But then we ask the broader question, okay, is it useful to provide support for chaining different business events together? But that's altogether
That's separate. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's an altogether separate discussion. And should the CDM automate that? Yes, absolutely. It's not a trivial problem. So ideally it should do that, but it's just a matter of if and when this gets prioritized. Okay. Number 3, remove rejected. So I think this one sounded quite consensual. If essentially we have 2 ways of specifying a rejection. We have that Boolean, but we also have the workflow status enum, which says rejected. And I think we also have event timestamp qualification enum that has something along the same lines. So I think we should strike out rejected and just have only one way of specifying whether it's been a rejection.
And does that mean approval gets changed as well?
Where is approval?
In the graphical, it's right below, at least where I'm looking at it, it's right below rejected. And also, by the way,
this is more than a Boolean, is it?
Say again?
This looks more like sorry, it's not a simple Boolean, is it?
No, it's got a Boolean in it, which is approved, which can be true or false.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Agreed, Dan. I think we want to have a single way of capturing that the stage that the workflow is at, and whatever it is that the parties have wanted to record as the reason for getting to that stage, regardless of what's the type of stage.
It's more likely a refactoring of approval into just combining rejected and approval into something more sensible. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for bringing approval. Actually, I didn't notice it. Okay.
Isn't it really all of it's about workflow state?
Sorry?
Yeah.
All about workflow state?
Yeah, agreed. That you're right, Dan. That I think it is meant to be captured by that.
So there's refactoring. That's arguably where the refactoring happens.
Yeah, agreed.
And there are a lot of workflows in workflow status, there are a lot of enums. And
Yeah,
I just,
let's talk about those for a second, because that's actually one of the next items. By the way, just maybe for the bit of context, I'm trying to remember how it is that we ended up in the current where the model is. And I think what happened so I think we inherited a relatively messy and ill-defined event model. And then there was that separation that was done between event and workflow. And effectively, we took all of the clean part around business or lifecycle event and put it there, and moved everything else on the side. But effectively, they all ended up being part of that workflow without looking further as to, but should we also look to rationalize those attributes? We took care of making business event pure, but workflow remained still contain the messier stuff. So I think this is the second pass into that, and it's going from where it is to also having a clean state. But let's talk a little bit about those enums then. Workflow status enum mixes different concerns. So we have things like accepted, canceled, rejected. I think those are clearly workflow concepts. But then you have cleared, or you have unconfirmed, or terminated. This has to do with a trade lifecycle event. So if we want to have workflow to be true to its purpose that we defined before, we should take all of those out. And effectively, anyone who's using any of those enums should instead look through the business event to find whether it's a clearing or termination or anything else of the kind. That's a wrong way to use the workflow.
and Leo, the state that you think we should leave as retained are accepted, rejected.
Yeah, so accepted, yes. Cancelled, yes. Certain, I have no idea what this means. Pending, yes. Rejected, yes. Submitted, yes. And that's it.
And what's the difference between pending and submitted?
Let's assume that in the example of a clearing event, that you have a collection of parties that all need to sign off on the event. Initially, the event would be proposed, but then as new approvals are being collected, effectively it is not approved until everyone has. But in the meantime, you need to have a way of recording what that is. So I think pending for me would be that.
They both seem to, like, it seems to me that you're saying submitted in a case like that, leaving aside what we define. Submitted is the beginning of waiting for people to respond. Pending says some people have responded.
Yeah.
That's a lot of that definition. The fact that some people have responded probably is an interrogation of the business event, not a change in state. And by the way, when Plowman asked earlier, I think he asked about whether business events are zero time. This is a situation where they're not, because they're actually waiting for counterparties to take action.
No, I don't think so. I think whilst you're waiting for parties to make decisions, it's like the business event doesn't happen. And then once everybody has signed off, then it happens atomically. There is no...
So the business event is zero time, but the workflow step is not zero time.
It is in a different state.
Yes. Yeah. The business event is zero time. The workflow is not.
Yeah. But it's a different state transition, and it's on a different scale. Is the more theoretical way.
That's fair. And then I just suggest that marking something as having moved from initiated or submitted to pending is creating an opportunity for the inconsistency. It's initiated and then it either ends up as accepted, canceled, or rejected.
I can concur with that.
Okay, simpler. Small is beautiful.
Just so which ones are we leaving then as workflow status?
Everything which smells of a business trade lifecycle event. So alleged, amended, cleared, affirmed, confirmed, yeah,
Okay.
terminated.
Okay, so just want to relate this back to, and maybe these are finer details to work out, but if you, on the actions option, attribute, if you click on action, you'll see it has new, right? It has new cancel, new correct cancel. So how does that relate to this status? You see the one I'm talking about?
Yes.
So I think the action to me was probably clear. It's like it's new, correct, or cancel. Not even sure actually we have a correct, I guess, correct or workflow step, right? I'm not even sure we have the process to do that, but you have a new, correct, cancel. And then I think as it said, you either have accepted or rejected. I think you could have pending. You could have a workflow step not yet completed. You could do that. You could initiate, unless you say, okay, you initiate a workflow step, which is meant to be a confirmation, or you've initiated a step, which is meant to be a transfer. Transfer is not yet complete. You could use that as a state to say it's pending approval or pending acceptance. But after you do the action, then the question is, it's in a state. It either accepted, rejected, or approved.
Yes. That's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah, one is almost the change of state of the workflow, and the other one is the result of the change of state. No, that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, there is probably a bit more to more to think about, but at least in terms of the direction of travel, it sounds like there is a broad agreement on scrubbing off everything which smells of a trade lifecycle event and keep the workflow status as a very small number really related to workflow. And we need to think of how it interacts with the action at the same time.
I'm lost on action. I appreciate we may come back to this in a different conversation.
It's yet another enum. I think what Tom was saying is effectively, let's be careful and think properly about the interaction between this other enum.
That's fair. I guess my question is, why do we need action? And it may be clear again to everyone else. Said differently, the workflow state is, it got created, it's in process, whatever we choose that word to mean, pending, submitted, or something, and it has an outcome of accepted, canceled, or rejected.
He's asking is action just the status as well?
What does it mean for a workflow step to be new, correct, or canceled? We're trying to capture like a history statement.
Sure. I would say the process would be, you created a workflow, right? Which is to record a business event, which is an execution. So you create the workflow step. The workflow step is going to be an execution, however that fits into your environment. And then you have to go about the process of actually running and executing the business event. Until the business event process is complete, you don't know whether you successfully completed it or not, right? Then you can come back and say, the business event is complete, and now the workflow step which was new, is now approved. Or it didn't complete, and you can say, that workflow step is canceled.
But is that
So,
about
it's not
or
always,
is that about the workflow?
it's not always, the process is not always that you execute the business event and then record it on a workflow step. You can construct a workflow step like you can construct a workflow. You can construct a workflow step and then go about executing the business events and putting them into the workflow step. So if a business event process doesn't take place, which you have this other code path that you're going down to do this, if that doesn't complete, then you have to come back and say, this workflow step is canceled because whatever reason, the trade execution didn't take place or something happened in the process. So that would be, it's not always built around doing the business event and then recording the workflow step. You could capture a set of workflow steps and then execute the business events. So you have to know, is this a new one or you have to correct the workflow step? So I think there's a series of work paths you can follow there where you need the two states. Or an action, you need action and state.
What you described, look, I'm not expert. You spent way more, folks on this call have spent way more time on this than I have. I have two comments. One, it really does sound like you're describing something about the workflow, the business event, not the workflow step. And two, and this is much more critical, is it seems like we end up in an uncertain state where technologically, where you would have to know the workflow status and the action information to know whether you succeeded or failed. Like having to join between, like there's cancel here. So having inaction, so having to know that you have two places, you could be canceled here and accepted in workflow status. And I don't know what that means. If there's some information that needs to be held at workflow step that's not included in accepted, canceled, pending, rejected, or then we should get it. I see, and it's about workflow step, it ought to be there. If it's something about the business event, a business event that's inside of a workflow step, we should capture it there. And it seems to me, if a business event somehow failed, then the workflow step is in pending. And your process is supposed to go and interrogate what the business events what the workflow step, what business events were contained in the workflow step, and what is their state. If there's so that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, it sounds like we probably have gotten most of the way there on this, but I think probably some use cases where we find what enumerations are needed. I think probably.
Fair.
Can
we just agree?
Or if the two separate levels are needed. Yeah.
And agree in operating practice, back to Leo's attempt to set the stage earlier, that there should be one place to look for things, not I have to go and look in two different things to conclude what the status is. And that was really my question about action. It feels like you're asking, you can't know what the status is of a workflow step without looking at action and workflow status, and that's confusing.
I think maybe the one thing I would add on that, which is missing here, is that there is no workflow step execution event to the process, right? So like a business event, you have an instruction, you give the instruction, you run the business event, right? It takes care of making the changes and setting an after state, right? So it takes care of that state process that goes on, right? It's built into the business event process when you execute it. As far as comes, a workflow doesn't have that, right? But it could, right? You could have a function to execute a workflow event or workflow step, and it could ensure that the state information is accurate, that the conditions in the states can only exist or correct. And also that relates also to the lineage question, which would be, it could also take care of doing the lineage or linking. Okay, this was the one that was executed. This is the one that was before, because we don't have this before, after state, before, after attributes in the workflow. You have to put it in there yourself, linking it through the lineage to connect it back to the prior. That may be a way of making sure if we do these, so you have different enumerations for different actions, that it actually is implemented within a function that actually executes the workflow event for you.
That's a great observation, Tom. I think there's a simplicity to the workflow step, and it's merely just business objects for you to manage your workflow. And it doesn't have the constraints and strong typing that I think you see in business event. And that's a question maybe for the group to think about beyond this. Yeah.
Litek, just a housekeeping question. How are we for time?
Yeah, we are behind, but I didn't want to interrupt the discussion. So let me show the time. So we were supposed to finish this discussion about 40 minutes ago. So we still have like the discussion on quantity change and position. We can certainly squeeze the last two sessions so that we have time to discuss things.
The proposal I would have is that we try and move quickly on quantity change, just because Tom is separately looking to schedule a dedicated CRWG session. But at least we can see if we can have, in terms of the broad direction of travel and the potential issues to discuss, put it on the table just to set the stage for the extraordinary CRWG session, to try and catch up on time, if that's okay. But maybe before we do that, can we wrap up the workflow thing? The summary is, yes, let's look to streamline that object as much as possible, remove attributes that are not necessarily or duplicated, or enumeration values that are duplicative. But in the course of doing that, there are potentially going to be some questions that are going to be raised. So the one around action and workflow status, that may not be trivial to address, but at least we have it sounds like we are setting a broad direction of travel.
Yep.
Okay.
So here we just want to have an overview of the quantity change.
Okay. So first bullet point, yeah, we agreed to do a deep dive. So that's what the extraordinary session is going to be about. One of the points, and actually that was raised by Dan earlier, is we look to extend the quantity change logic in Rune. On our end, we stand ready to do that. It's just a matter of, it's just a matter of prioritizing. But because there are some other questions, let's say adjacent to that quantity change, we'd like to get some direction on those questions before we invest the time in exposing all of the logic in Rune. And I think that overarching question was about the separation of the price change and quantity change. Should we split them? I think a number of participants, maintainers have said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. We should do that. I just wanted to point out so just for context, there is a primitive today, which is called quantity change primitive, I think, which in fact, a better name would be price and quantity change primitive, because you can use that primitive to effectively change the price and or the quantity of a trade. And that appears to be problematic. Now, I wanted to just level set by explaining why it is that we seem to have that primitive that changes both. And to do that, I would point at the fact that whether you're doing an increase or a decrease, so effectively a change in quantity, in both cases, you need to specify a price. So obviously, when you do an increase, you need to specify the price at which you're doing it. But also when you do a decrease or a termination, you need to specify the price at which you're doing it if there is a closeout, and this could result in even a cash flow payment to terminate that trade. So that's the reason why it's not just a quantity change in isolation, it's changing both the quantity and the price. So just to say that it's not as simple as, let's have two primitives instead of one. You need to specify a price in both those scenarios. So I just wanted to make a quick pause there, just to make sure that the problem is well understood before moving on to try and solutioning it. But is
Leo, sorry.
Starting point of your session, Tom?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was saying that's the starting point for your session, Tom.
Yes. That's correct. So you're right. We're going to have a deep dive on this. Just before I have a comment on that, just so everyone knows, I did send out a notice with a proposed date, which would be Monday. So far, based on a couple of the responses I've got, it will be on Monday, and it will be 11 a.m. Eastern time or 4 p.m. UK. And I'm just arranging to schedule that meeting through FINOS so that it's on Zoom and everything. Hopefully should see a notice on that and an agenda on it soon. We did say that prior to that, we should resolve a couple of these issues. And I just wanted to ask a question on that point, Leo. From what I can see, as much as in terms of what you said about the price needed for quantity change, I don't see anything in the underlying code that does the quantity and price change where there's a dependency on the price, or that the price you had on the security would not get carried forward onto as part of the price. So if you didn't change the price, you'll still have the same price. If you are changing the quantity and you want to change the price, you would change the price as well. I didn't see anything in the low level changing the price and changing the quantity, because they're really distinct functions that take place where they actually depended on each other.
Yeah, honestly, I don't remember exactly. I don't know top of my head what the logic does, but I think it's pointing at the fact that trying to change price and quantity all together is potentially not the right approach for the problem at hand. And just to throw my hat in the ring here, I'd like to suggest a different split of the primitives and reintroduce the idea of having that termination primitive that would effectively supersede that quantity change. But we can discuss that more in the extraordinary session, keeping the concern that Dan mentioned at the beginning, which is the objective should be to have a well-partitioned state transition model where there is only one way to arrive to get from A to B as long as the primitives are well designed.
And Leo, to qualify, I think it's an explicit objective that the primitives are small and independent. I think it's a discussion about whether you can end up in a particular state through different paths of the combinations of the primitives. Although if it's a terminal state of some kind, maybe not even terminal, the ability to query the trade and know what state it's in gets complicated if you have multiple paths.
Yeah.
If there's two ways to end up with essentially to be terminated, for example, and I appreciate you're suggesting termination via primitives, or at least I think so. But if there's two ways to get there, then you have the challenge of being able to ask, is the trade terminated?
Mm.
Can I just, not to derail this, it's sort of design discussion, but is that in terms of maturity, Leo? Like maturing a trade?
No, it's literally in terms of doing an early termination agreed between parties.
And reducing the quantity to zero.
So either fully terminating it or partially terminating it.
Okay. Okay, because one of the other things observed is there's no event that matures a trade like at a time. But anyway, let's not get into that.
So sorry, just going back to the first question, which we thought we would resolve before we have the meeting. It seemed logical that you should separate price and quantity into separate functions. And I think that's the origin of this request here. I haven't seen any specific problems with the fact that they are combined together. So it seemed logical that price and quantity should be different, but there isn't anything where I haven't seen a use case yet where it's problematic in the fact that it does the two together. In fact, I think part of the reason that there is logic in there that actually allows you to replace an entire trade lot, and trade lot encompasses both price and quantity. So it would be almost more problematic without problematic just in terms of handling the change if they were split into two. Maybe the name change would be useful. So it's price and quantity, but I find out, even though I had initially maybe thought that, yeah, it would make sense to, I'm struggling to find any kind of a case where it actually doesn't, where it's problematic that it does the two together. And the fact that it has this full trade lot replacement feature may be in fact useful. So I don't know how we can come to a conclusion on this. We thought maybe we would, unless there's a strong case for splitting them either because it ends up with something in a wrong state or something that can't be executed correctly. It sounds like almost we should leave it the way it currently is. Does anyone have any questions or objections or comments on that? Okay, maybe it's to be finally ratified or something at the meeting when it's held. One other point I would make on it, there's about 4 issues that were raised that are all going to be addressed at that meeting on Monday. I think the parent issue, which is number 3816 that Leo brought up, lists all the issues that are all linked together. One point, I actually put together a small spreadsheet on the analysis of various products and what attributes they use in terms of the matching process, because this is where some problems originate. So I had asked, if you scroll down to the bottom there on that LeTech, if you could, there's the issues. On the bottom, there's a spreadsheet. I put in there a couple of examples of bonds, repos, security lending, interest rate swap, fixed flow, what attributes they actually use in the matching process for changing prices and quantities. If others have examples, product examples, it would be great if you can go in here and add them in the same format, which is the product, put in the price attributes that are required, and then put in what fields are actually used, both for changing price or for changing quantity. And this will help identify where there's some gaps in the matching process, which is one of the issues, because it either doesn't match something and doesn't update, or it matches two things and updates them both incorrectly. So this would be maybe quite helpful if anyone else could go in, put in any product that there is in their domain, put in all the different prices that are required on a particular product, and then that may be helpful for addressing this when we talk on Monday.
What do you mean by matching? Sorry.
So in the price quantity process, what happens is you indicate that in the instruction, because you submit an instruction and say change, or you put in an instruction, you say, oh, this is the price, and its unit is a currency value, and this is the currency. What happens when it actually gets fed into the code that does the change, it goes through the objects, it goes through the price objects, and tries to find all the price objects that match that parameter, right? So anything that would match on currency, right, no matter what type of price, you could have 4 prices in there, all different things. And if they weren't distinguished in terms of anything other parameter, it would have matched them all and it would change them all. Or it could not match. Maybe you didn't match exactly, and then it won't change. So there's a number of cases here. This is actually within the code. You can see it actually just sweeps through all the price objects and then actually says, okay, does this match the parameters of the instruction? If they don't match the parameter, if they do match, it'll change them all. And there's some parameters there that are not matched. I think one that was noted, like dated value, which is part of quantity, is not in the instruction at all, or not in the code at all to actually be used in the match process. So I think I was trying to identify gaps or issues where there's overlap, where you can't really distinguish or identify the price object that you actually want to change. And that was one or more of the issues that were raised. So again, I just want to identify the sheet. If you have other products in your domain and you need 3 different prices, underlying price or premium or fee or something like that, if you can put in the product, put in the parameters and how they'd be identified, it may be that there's some price type identifiers, enumerations that are missing. And for that reason, you can't correctly distinguish between 2 different price types. That's, I think, maybe if anyone can do that before Monday, that'd be helpful.
All right. I
That's all I have on that.
Yeah. I suggest we take a 5-minute break, and then we'll continue with the rest of the items. Yeah. Let's be back at 42. All right, welcome back. Let's get started on the last leg of the workshop. So next, we're going to discuss position. And let me bring up the set of questions that we put together. Leo, do you want to show back? Do you want to get started?
Hey. So yeah, I'm back. Yes, this is it's a concept that we've tiptoed around a few times already, and which is like a common thread whenever we talk about trade life cycle or business event. And it's effectively that concept of position in the model, which is already there, which has been developed in an earlier stage of development and has barely been touched since, but the model has evolved quite a lot since then. So to the extent that a business event effectively has an effect on a trade, which itself can be considered a position, basically one idea would be to try and unify all of those concepts together and effectively try to all have them built out of the same common ancestor. And in addition to that, this was a part that was mentioned before about counterparty position. So this was developed in a later stage of the model, and specifically in response to reporting requirement for EMIR, which had to look at exchange traded derivatives. So effectively fungible position in contracts that are traded via an exchange. So this is what this counterparty position is now handling. And we effectively have two parallel structure in business event, one looking at the trade life cycle and the other one looking at the counterparty position life cycle. I guess the direction of travel that can be considered from where we are today is to try and unify all of that under a single umbrella and start at a very fundamental component, which is the position level. And effectively, it can be considered that everything, whether it's a trade or whether it's an event which effectively has an impact on a trade, all of that are in some way, shape, or form a position. Even an event, which is a difference between two positions, can be thought of as a position itself. So that's in essence the proposal, but it's to try and harmonize all of those different components in the model to make them more useful and interoperable with each other. I'll pause there. Sorry. And just if there is any comment.
Yeah, sorry. Can you just clarify then again what the definition of counterparty position is? Does it have to be it's meant only to be a position where you are the counterparty to the trade, or meaning it's used primarily to measure your exposure to a particular counterparty, or can it be any entity that has accounts with positions for, let's say, counterparties or positions for clients would also contain their position information, which would, my point being, probably not directly be linked to trades.
Yeah, it's meant to represent where a trade is effectively not seen from the perspective of one particular counterparty of the trade. It's the trade, and it implies two counterparties. For exchange traded product, really what you want to consider is the perspective of the counterparty other than the exchange that is effectively holding the position. So this is what counterparty position is. It's that sort of single party perspective on a position, which compared to OTC transaction, effectively is applicable in the case of an exchange traded product where you want to consider the position of that single party that's holding it.
I'm sorry, apologies. I'm still confused. Is if a counterparty position is something where we're trying to keep track of a change in the trade and exchange traded derivative where the counterparty where the counterparty is the exchange, or something different?
Where the counterparty is not the exchange.
So if I do an off exchange futures trade, I'm trying to keep track of with whom I did the off exchange trade. Or if I do a trade that directly with the counterparty as opposed to leaving it to open outcry.
Okay, rewind. Forget everything. It is meant to be the position that you have in an exchange traded derivative. Just to make things simpler.
So it's an aggregate of all your trades,
Correct.
or it's the individual trade.
It's the aggregate.
Sorry, stupid question. Is there maybe a business event that's supposed to collapse, that's supposed to yield a collapsed position? Is that another way to handle it?
No, but effectively, because it's a parallel structure, you need a parallel sort of business event model that handles state transition for the counterparty position. So effectively, whenever you're trading in or out, you want to have a business event that effectively captures that and that acts on the counterparty position. Regardless of whether it's collapsed or not.
My 2 cents, if for this conversation, and others may feel strongly differently, is that this is definitely, it feels like one which can't be trivially responded to, meaning in a couple minutes. I'm certain I don't know enough and for myself, and just need to see some work through some examples for myself, and maybe for others to be able to say, what refactoring should be pursued.
Sorry, if I understand the question here is whether to put something between trade state and trade that represents a combined counterparty position and trade. I probably didn't ask that question correctly, but is that it says, should they come from a common ancestor? The ancestor of trades is trade state. So what is the proposal or question?
Sorry, can you repeat that? You said the ancestor of trade is trade state?
Yeah.
Didn't you mean the other way around?
Oh, okay. Sorry. So the ancestor, all right.
You did mean the other way.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, the idea is, should they all be inheriting from the same base component, which means we enact in the model the fact that they all share a big commonality, which means this then makes it amenable to doing things on one that we could do on another, just because they share the same attributes. And we can
Maybe just a question on that. What is, I see counterparty position as simply an aggregation method on your trades, right? So it's just a container or aggregator of trades that are against a particular counterparty. Maybe I'm missing something here. What exactly is the need for events that take place on the counterparty position that pulls the two together?
sorry, let me reformulate. It is not, in fact, an aggregation of an existing set of trades. It is a parallel structure that is specifically designed for aggregating fungible position, typically in exchange traded derivatives. And therefore, it's a parallel structure and it needs its own business event model to be able to change the state. So effectively add, remove positions, etc. In the same way as you have a business event model to handle the life cycle of trades. You have a business event model for handling the life cycle of counterparty position, which are seen from the perspective of a single party, which holds those positions versus an exchange. Like one suggestion I have given the comments on the current call is I think we should move on and move to the next section, which is the adoption facilitation, especially given we're pressed for time. Litek, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry about that. So the next session is things that we can do to increase the understanding and knowledge around the topic. This is a short brainstorming session exercise where we want to gather input from people on the things that are missing, that we need to do, that we can improve. So, or maybe that open the floor. So these are some examples. So we could create more examples. We could improve the documentation. So let me open the floor. And I don't know if Lionel has anything to add.
I spoke earlier about documentation, and I think there's multiple ways of doing documentation. There's obviously the CDM FINOS documentation website, but there's also documentation in the form of comments in the code, examples and sample files that can be distributed as part of the FINOS distribution or using the visualization capability in Rosetta. Then there's the sort of more loosely defined documentation in the form of videos, blog postings, training courses, and all of those type of things. So I see there's quite a few people still on the call, including some from a number of institutions out there who might be trying to adopt this. Maybe it would be good to hear from some of those participants as they've listened into this conversation. What further assistance might they find useful to increase the adoption of CDM and to understand these topics in more detail?
a bit of silence. I'm just going to chime in. I think Chris Rayner had written a paper also on workflow step, etc., that should just be included in our documentation, actively included in the documentation.
Litek, maybe it's a question that you can circulate afterwards to the participants. Maybe people would like to give some feedback more anonymously.
Yeah, okay. So you also like webinars, one-on-one maybe. So we'll leave that open. So there's also the inventory of events. So maybe closing well, fleshing those out, make sure that everything is documented. All right. So if there are no more input on this, so we'll circulate that as a question. So this brings us to the last session of the workshop, which is a small session. So we wanted to discuss what are the next steps in terms of what happens now that we've completed the workshop. So the plan is to summarize the 2 days, to extract the issues that have been identified, and then go through a round of prioritization to determine like what's important, what's urgent, what's critical, what's more nice to have. And that will help us to develop a roadmap, which will then be used to drive implementation. So for example, we may have from the workshop, we may have 10 items that we want to do. So we want to enhance the model with 10 or 20 items. So we want those identified and we want to see the priority. And then we want to, we need to understand like who is going to take over the work. So the workshop was just organized to jumpstart the discussion or to refocus the discussion. So to a large extent, some of the discussion, some of the issues have been discussed like in GitHub for some time. So the workshop was a way to perhaps shed more light on these issues, make them more visible. It was also like important to have more participation than the participation from the working group. So we've had that with the additional attendees over the 2 days. So I think the natural group that would take over the work would be the CRWG. So the Contribution Review Working Group, since it has taken like ownership of all things related to workflows and business events, but that's up for discussion here. So is it the CRWG or is it another like group that takes over the work that we started here? And then who owns like from the list of 10 or 20 items, who owns the items, who makes sure that they are pushed forward, and also who will develop who will implement that in CDM, what are the resources that are needed. With that said, any comments from anyone, any suggestions on how to move forward?
Litek, some of the items actually may not fall within the CRWG if they involve changes in the underlying model. So, in other words, if they don't involve changes specifically in the model, but require extensions to Room to be able to model some of the things that we want to do. So that may fall outside CRWG, may fall into the technology architecture group, and prior to some of these things, anyways, there's going to be approval required by the SWG.
Another
And Leitio, yeah, I echo Tom's comment that this seems, since these aren't directly on the CDM roadmap today, that these would need sponsorship by the SWG.
All right. And perhaps instead of the CRWG, that could be work for potential task force like we had for the asset refactoring. So maybe it is a new task force that is formed to take a look at the workflow. So in terms of like agreeing to the prioritization, like how do we do that? So we heard from different firms who have different, who brought up different issues. So some issues may be more important to their customers or to them. How do we prioritize that work?
Latex, just from what I've heard, I think on the discussion, there was general agreement and we made progress on refactoring the workflow step attributes, right? So we had already started to decide which ones we'll keep, which ones we'll remove. There was probably still some questions about some of them that needs to be taken up, but I think that was probably generally agreed, and that's my view, is generally agreed, and something that could take place and under maybe some additional work and a special meeting, a special CRWG meeting or something of that sort. And the other one was, of course, that we're going to have the quantity change meeting, and we're going to proceed with both probably making changes and also fixing some of the issues that are there. And that's going to at least get initiated with the meeting on that has hopefully take place on Monday.
Mm-hmm.
As far as prioritizing on the next one, just again, my view is that we have 3 topics to bring to these SWG. One is on changing or adding non-trade events, right? Non-trade workflow steps, non-trade workflow steps. And I guess I won't separate them out, but it was also, there were other scenarios all falling under that. It involved transfers, it involved non-trade objects, and I forgot there was one other one, transfer non-trade objects. But I think generally, then the other item was the prescribed workflows, right? So implementing, like setting up a task force to look at designing or implementing prescribed workflows. I think needs some presentation, some example, something put together, a proposal on why we need to do it, why we should do it, and it needs to be approved by the SWG.
And Tom, what do you mean by prescribed workflows? Are you talking about rule books?
Yeah. Prescribed workflows, but custom rule books or specific exchange types things, right? It could also be best practices, just implementing a best practice if you want to. It could be an internal prescribed workflow. It's like it's between your front office, middle office, clients, right? Somebody should be able, a firm, you should be able to model or design your own custom workflow, prescribed custom workflow. So as we said, you can do this action and then you have A, B, and C that you can do after that. And it has to complete with, and then final step is whatever F, right? So you have to building prescribed workflows would require something to be able to model that.
All right. I think that's very good feedback. I don't know if
And I think, sorry, the other one was, of course, the documentation, the point that Lionel made as a priority as well, probably somewhere up there.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Anything else that's been missed? All right. So I think I have enough input here to summarize what needs to happen. Any final feedback that people would like to give on the next steps before we close the call?
Not on next steps, but thank you all. Thank you for the contribution. It's very helpful.
Yes, thank you, everyone. I think that was a very, very good session with a lot of good feedback. So we'll bear with us to put the notes together, and then we'll meet again in working groups. For those who are not subscribed to working groups, please sign up, because to the CRWG in particular, and other working groups that are of interest to you. So we'll continue the discussions there. We will receive the good feedback, and we'll look to move those forward. So thank you again for your participation, and talk to you soon.